This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Welcome everybody to the latest seminar of the Contraction History Society. I'm disappointed there aren't more people here because I thought this would be a really interesting and exciting topic. And as a person who's advertised it, I feel personally liable for the shortfall. Anyway, as you all know, Bridget is going to talk about women's relation to voluntary work within the UK women's liberation movement.
Okay, so today I'm going to talk about the voluntary work carried out by women in the women's liberation movement in the UK during the 1970s and 1980s. Now, I'm slightly hesitant to use the term voluntary work, and this will be something I'll explore over the course of the paper. The talk is based on a couple of research projects, neither of which focus specifically on the relationship between voluntary work and the women's movement. So the first is my PhD research, which I finished last year, which focused on women's first engagements with work, paid and unpaid, in the voluntary sector, their motivations and how they experience this work. I interviewed 28 women who were paid workers, volunteers, or both in many cases, in small to medium-sized charities in the Bradford district, Bradford in West Yorkshire. So these interviews took the form of working life histories, and through analysis of these, I examined how the voluntary sector had changed as a workplace since the 1970s, for women in particular. The second piece of research is a small oral history project which I conducted on the women's liberation movement, which I will henceforth abbreviate to WLM, even though I find it quite hard to say, in Bradford again. So I interviewed 9 women who were active in the movement in Bradford. So although the location of both projects was the same, they were, as I believed, on 2 distinct topics, and different women were interviewed for each. Yet shared themes emerged. In the oral history project, the women I interviewed discussed their feminist activism alongside what could be described as their voluntary work within the movement. And conversely, a number of those I interviewed for my PhD research, paid workers and volunteers in the charity sector, discussed their previous involvement in the WLM. So although this topic has not been the direct focus of my research, I've always been drawn to investigating it further. I was almost put off a couple of years ago when a well-known feminist scholar and someone who was in the movement told me she didn't really understand what I was getting at, and she'd never considered her activism work. So many who were in the women's movement may think that to call some parts of what they did voluntary work may be to sanitise it in some way and to make it more acceptable and less radical. And this is not what I aim to do. Instead, I want to explore the complexities between political involvement and voluntary work, highlighting the importance of political motivations as catalysts for individual and groups' engagement in voluntary work, something which gives it momentum and structure and helps to sustain it. I also want to highlight the contribution and influence of the women's movements on many services we now take for granted within the public and voluntary sectors. So today I'm going to give a brief overview of the women's movement. I'm going to discuss some of its activities and the services that were set up as a result by women in the movement. And I'll also examine the complex relationship between feminist activism and aims and voluntary work. And then I'll before moving on to discuss how the organisations that were set up within the movement developed. And here I'll discuss mainstreaming, professionalisation and bureaucratisation, and what some of the women within these organisations felt about it. So throughout this talk, I'll be using the WLM in Bradford as a case study, and this is not to suggest that the movement in Bradford was in any way typical, and in fact I've argued in previous research that there were some elements, such as its small size, heady political atmosphere and diverse population, which collided to make it quite distinctive. But the organisations and services which emerged in Bradford as a result of the WLM corresponded to what was happening in a lot of towns and cities across the UK. So what was the women's movement? Most people talk about a movement of the 1960s and 70s, but it really didn't get going in anywhere other than London until the 1970s, hitting its peak in the mid-1970s and continuing well into the 1980s. So to give a bit of flavour of what the objectives were in the British movement, here are its 7 demands. So 1 to 4 were agreed, which you can't actually see. 1 to 4 were agreed at the 1971 National Conference, with 5 and 6 being added in 1974. And the 7th demand was passed at the last National Conference in 1978. So they were, in order, equal pay, equal education and job opportunities, free contraception and abortion on demand, free 24-hour nurseries, legal and financial independence for all women, the right to a self-defined sexuality and an end to discrimination against lesbians, and the 7th one, which is quite wordy, freedom for all women from intimidation by the threat or use of violence or sexual coercion, regardless of marital status, and an end to the laws, assumptions and institutions which perpetuate male dominance and aggression to women. So the demands were about affecting a deep social change in almost every sphere of life and were the key campaign areas. But they also formed the impetus for some of the organisations which would emerge from the movement. So the WLM was a dispersed social and political movement involving relatively small groups of women from towns and cities across the UK. By the mid-1970s, there were irreconcilable splits within the national movement, which this quote from the Bradford Women's Group demonstrated. So they said, "There are very real splits in the women's movement between gay and straight women, working class and middle class women, intellectual and non-intellectual women, socialists and non-socialists, radical feminists and others, monogamous and non-monogamous, etc." And these debates raged on, and one of the reasons why 1978 was the last national conference was because there wasn't any overall agreement. There was also a big north-south divide, and many in the movement didn't feel represented by the London-dominated national movement. So although the lack of unity between WM groups across the country was to a certain extent detrimental to the overall effectiveness of the movement, it also meant that groups could reflect and debate the specific issues which affected women in their own city or town and provide services for women in their local area, such as a women's aid refuge or rape crisis helpline. So the first refuge that was set up in Chiswick in 1971, and this was the start of what would eventually become the Charity Refuge. And the National Women's Aid Federation was established in 1974 following this. So the National Federation was actually formed after a split within the refuge movement between refuges aligned with Erin Pizzey, who was the founder of the Chiswick Refuge, and those aligned with the women's movement. So Pizzey did not want to be associated with the women's movement, largely because she did not view domestic violence as a specifically male crime against women. And she believed, and still does, that the WM co-opted the refuge movement, even though she herself was part of the women's movement in its early years. Yet the political impetus behind the refuge movement proved key to their success, with refuges popping up across Britain after 1974, although some had stronger links to the National Federation than others. And this quote from the annual report of the National Women's Aid Federation captures this phenomenon. They said, "During the 70s, refuges for battered women sprang up all over the country, from tower blocks and townhouses, council estates and rural villages, rows of terraces and city suburbs. Battered women began to leave home and build lives for themselves and their children. It became clear that battering has not died out in the Victorian times, but had gone on behind closed doors ever since. A national network of women's aid group was established and grows year by year." So, rape crisis was established, even though it actually emerged in the US. It was established in the UK in 1973 and spread across the country in a similar way to women's refuges. Local WM groups would run rape crisis helplines, and some would offer face-to-face advice and counselling services. So in Bradford, their first attempt at setting up a women's aid refuge was in 1974. And I say first attempt because the first attempt was not successful, and there were a few more attempts across the 1970s, but it was eventually established. And the Rape Crisis Centre was established in 1978, and both organisations remain in the city today, despite the constant threat of funding cuts. So these are the organisations we think about when we think about charities associated with the women's movement. But voluntary work within the WM was not just carried out within these well-known and enduring organisations. So the interviews in both research projects discuss running free crèche facilities, play groups, establishing an advice line for lesbians, running a women's health collective which offered free pregnancy testing and advice, and an ongoing attempt to set up a women's centre, which was finally achieved in 1986. So the work they did was an extension of their activism in the women's movement, a practical way of effecting change and improving women's circumstances. So one example was a free pregnancy testing and advice service run by the Women's Health Collective in Bradford. The women's health movement was a really crucial part of the UK women's movement, stemming from a similar movement in the US, which had produced the influential book Our Bodies, Ourselves. It was seen as an extension of consciousness raising for women to learn about their bodies and take ownership of them as a means of liberation. So the Bradford Women's Health Collective was founded by a small group of nurses and midwives in the city, although you didn't have to be a medical professional to be part of the group. So they produced their own material, which you can see on the slide, which was in a similar vein to Our Bodies, Ourselves, responding to the health issues within the local population in a frank but sympathetic tone. So the collective, like many others around the country, went beyond publishing much needed information. The free pregnancy testing and advice initiative provided a service which would have been difficult for women to access if they did not want to go to their GP, who would often be the family doctor and could be quite judgmental. Pregnancy testing kits were not available to purchase and family planning clinics were not as common. So Liz, and the names I use are pseudonyms. So Liz was a founding member of the collective, and she discussed why the service was set up. So she said, at first I think we just used to get together and do something they called consciousness raising and just talk. But I think quite quickly we thought we'd like to do something practical. And that's when I first started doing the free pregnancy testing service. So I suppose part of what we were trying to do is provide a service for women that might have concerns about pregnancy. They could talk about what their options might be and what might be available if they wish to. They may just come along and have the tests, but women could have the tests quickly and they would know quickly. But they would be, if they wanted to, they could talk more about what their circumstances were and they would feel comfortable to do that. So this service ran in Bradford until the early 1990s, when it stopped because the organisers felt access to family planning provision had improved in the area and home testing kits had become more easily available to buy. The Bradford Women's Health Collective is just one example of an organisation established within a political movement, not set up to campaign politically, but instead to provide a vital service. Those who provided the service were involved in WLM-related campaigns, such as campaigns opposing restrictions on abortion, and some were members of the radical midwifery groups, for example. But these were political people meeting a social need, and so they crossed the blurry line between political activism and voluntary work. This was the same for many of the women I interviewed. Their work was driven by feminist politics, but also sprung from an urgency to meet a need and, in a sense, focus their political feeling into doing something practical. So, as Elizabeth Woodcraft, one of the first national coordinators of Women's Aid, said, for me, the National Women's Aid Federation was putting feminism into action, making the world a safer, happier place for women and children. You can see this too in this excerpt from the Bradford Women's Liberation newsletter, which discussed why Bradford Rape Crisis was started in 1978. So it emerged in Bradford from a protest movement called Reclaim the Night, which actually had a lot of significance in Bradford and neighbouring Leeds due to the Peter Sutcliffe murders, which were still ongoing and were very much a threat. And as they say, they also arose from a desire to do something concrete for women who had been raped. And this was the case for Claire, one of my interviewees, who in the 1980s, galvanised by her involvement with the WM at university, was eager to find something within the movement that was practical and useful, so joined a local rape support service as a volunteer. So discussing this, she said, as far as I remember, we did quite a lot of consciousness raising. So there was lots of talking and learning, which was fantastic, but we didn't really do anything very practical. And this, the rape support service she joined, was going to be a feminist group that was actually doing something practical and useful. So that's why it appealed to me. Claire, like many of the women I interviewed, was a recently politicised young woman who wished to channel her feminism into making a discernible difference to women's lives. Other women, like Kathleen, weren't necessarily involved in the WLM initially, and in fact entered into the women's movement through her voluntary work. So in 1974, Kathleen actively searched for volunteer work at a women's shelter after she and a friend watched the TV documentary Scream Quietly or The Neighbours Will Hear, which documented the work of Chiswick Women's Aid, which was established in 1971. And this was one of the first documentaries to show the pervasiveness of violence against women. And I would really recommend watching this film, which glimpses at the scale of domestic violence and the need for this type of service, but also shows how completely haphazard, ad hoc and chaotic the refuge initially was. So at the time of filming, there were 18 women and 46 children living in just one house. So for Kathleen, this volunteer role evolved into long-term involvement with domestic violence organisations, feminist politics and a career in the voluntary sector. In Kathleen's case, partaking in this type of voluntary work had been a catalyst for politicisation rather than the other way around. It seems obvious to me that much of the work done within these organisations in the 1970s and 80s was motivated by feminist politics, but was still voluntary work, and corresponds to Josh Sheard's description of volunteering as unpaid, freely chosen, done through the medium of an organisation or agency, and for the benefit of others or the environment as well as oneself. But there were differences in the way this work was viewed by those who did it. So Jan Pahl, writing about Women's Aid in 1979, argued that women's aid must be acknowledged to be one of the most notable and innovative forms of voluntary action to be seen in Britain in the 1970s. Yet many of those who have worked hardest for women's aid would not see themselves as volunteers in the traditional sense, nor as having been engaged in involuntary action. What does this add to our understanding of the distinction between being a member of a voluntary association and being involved in a social movement? The women Pahl interviewed in the women's aid movement had very different views about what they were doing. So some viewed their work entirely in political terms. As one interview said, "I never wanted to participate in a charity. I don't see it as my job to provide accommodation for women unless it's got a very clear emphasis on politics and feminism. Unless it's got that significant role to play, I don't think there's any point in doing it at all. It's just an extension of social services and just doing them a favour." So for this interviewee, the overall goal was to recognise and eradicate male violence against women, which she felt could be achieved through this work. Providing a service was a secondary aim. So why did she not want to participate in a charity? Was it because she thought being a charity would fundamentally de-radicalise and depoliticise their work? What is clear is she didn't want women's aid to be filling the gaps left behind by social services and doing their job for them. For her, that would not be the way to instigate real change and the social revolution that was required to end violence against women. So not all felt this way, of course. Another of Pahl's interviewees said, "I just wasn't very enthusiastic about the feminist side of it. The refuge was the urgent thing. The feminist bit could wait until we had the refuge." So as with any social or political movement, you find people more or less aligned to the majority's aims. For this interviewee, the fact that it was a feminist organisation was neither here nor there. There was urgent work that needed to be done. However, what was really important to Claire, one of my interviewees, was that the organisation she volunteered at was run on feminist principles, not only through its activities with the service users, but in terms of decision making. So she said, "The thing I loved and value so much about it was the fact that we were a collective, and that we made decisions as a collective until we reached a consensus. I've worked so much now in big hierarchical organisations that it worked. It just worked so well, and I felt as valued and as able to influence what was happening as the paid workers." I think it's important to recognise that these organisations were set up as feminist, not just because of what they did with women, but also to try and bring about a change in the way things were run and to create a less hierarchical and more egalitarian world. So for Susie, another interviewee, who had also been involved in a rape support service for many years as a volunteer and a paid worker. Her feminist politics were what sustained her commitment to the organisation and job she was doing. So she remarked, well, I'm a feminist, so it's part of a political thing to work within an organisation like this. But also know how the organisation works. It's a holistic thing. Rather than just think, I've got a job, I'll just go do that job 9 to 5, then I'll go home. My politics, my feminist politics, doesn't go like that. So what I hope to have drawn out here is the link between political activism and voluntary work, and the complex, sometimes uneasy relationship women within the WM forge between them. Because the basis for this research emerged somewhat organically out of interviews I was conducting on different topics, I never asked the direct question, did you consider yourself a volunteer, or did you consider what you were doing to be voluntary work? However, I get the sense that those who remained in the voluntary sector were more inclined to see themselves as volunteers than those that went on to do other things, and those who went on to do other things were more ambivalent. This was perhaps because those that stayed within the voluntary sector, not necessarily within women's organisations, were more willing to accept that important politically driven work could be done within the confines of a voluntary organisation and by volunteers, as they had to an extent proved. For those outside the voluntary sector, they were less convinced of its political power and preferred to regard their WLM activities as political activism. This is of course a generalisation and is something that if I had the chance I would like to explore in further depth. However, neither group of women really wanted to be thought of what they termed as do-gooders. And like Kathleen said, they were angry young women who posed a threat to the status quo. What is clear is that within these organisations, a feminist ideological focus was directly mapped onto the work carried out, and in most cases fundamentally shaped how the organisation was run. But as these organisations grew older, it became more difficult to retain some of the qualities many felt were inherent in making organisations feminist. So I'm now going to talk about the development of these organisations and the process of mainstreaming and becoming acceptable. I think at first we have to understand what kind of conditions these women were dealing with in the early years of these organisations, such as Rape Crisis or Women's Aid. Susie and Kathleen both discussed the personal risk volunteers faced. So Susie said, when I first started, nobody was paid at all. You went and rescued women from all sorts of situations. You had women and kids sleeping in the front room, until you could find them a home. But I was working sometimes 15 hours a day because there was so much work to do. And Kathleen likewise discussed the threat of physical violence she faced at the refuge she volunteered at. So she said, when we were all volunteers in Women's Aid, even the paid workers, we were on call like 24 hours a day. And the dangers we underwent, I was 3 times assaulted by a man. We used to get a call from the refuge about 2 o'clock in the morning and you'd just go. And anybody could have been there on those grounds, and on a couple of occasions they were. It wasn't our refuge, it wasn't just our refuge, it was every refuge in the country. So there's a lot more. And she's talking about there's a lot more rules and regulations now, and there should be, and I'm sure a lot of people were quite badly hurt. So this exposure to risk and long hours was not sustainable, even for those fired by feminist zeal. As Kathleen commented, if you're always walking near the edge, it keeps quite a lot of energy to stop you getting vertigo. It's really important to recognise the personal toll on volunteers and paid workers of maintaining this type of service day in and day out. Often when we look at how organisations develop, we fail to consider how individuals shape this development and instead look at social and political interventions. However, the impact of individuals drawing a line and saying enough is enough, we can't do this anymore, should also be considered. Inevitably, organisations that evolved as part of the WLM had to become more mainstream in order to apply for funding and survive. And this involved increased bureaucracy and coming up against and working with both the public and voluntary services. So this cartoon depicts, which is from the Bradford Women's Action Group newsletter, depicts the fight to get a women's centre in Bradford and the perceived obstacles of bureaucracy they faced. The text underneath explained that their latest fight had been with the Bradford Council for Voluntary Services to get a room in their building for a women's centre and a rape crisis helpline. The CVS recognised the need and were sympathetic, but ultimately gave the room to another organisation. So when Kathleen discussed her work with Women's Aid in the 1970s and 80s, she discussed her realisation that she and her colleagues were not being taken seriously by the local council they interacted with because they did not look and sound professional enough. So she remarked, "So we had to learn how to become professional, and some people went over to the other side, but we all eventually wore trouser suits and had briefcases, and it was just learning. It's learning the ropes, isn't it?" Kathleen described her and her colleagues' work within the early years of the refuge as kids playing in the dark, and that they needed to grow up. For some, this professionalisation meant the organisations were inherently less political. Those organisations which were run as a collective were forced by necessity to become registered charities with management committees in order to receive funding and continue their work. Susie was particularly disappointed by this development, which occurred in many organisations in the early 1990s. So she commented that if you worked in Women's Aid, if you worked in rape crisis, you would find feminists, you'd find radical feminists, you'd find lesbians, because they were the ones who set these organisations up in the first place. So it's actually more difficult now. It's changed because you've got people coming in that actually want a job. They're not bothered about the history, they're not bothered about the principles of the organisation. They want a job 9 to 5. So for Susie, the development of these organisations, their professionalisation and mainstreaming had contributed to their depoliticisation. In her view, the people working within them were no longer putting feminist politics at the heart of their organisation. Claire too was disappointed that her rape support service had abandoned its collective principles for a traditional hierarchy with a management committee, but also admitted that it was probably necessary. A lot of the changes that occurred happened as a result of organisations becoming less volunteer-led and more run by paid workers. And this was not uncontentious. So in the 1980s, Rebecca, another interviewee who volunteered and worked for a Women's Aid refuge, recalled a lot of controversy when the organisation proposed to employ a fundraiser, as this person would not be involved in helping service users. So for Susie, employing more paid workers was to the detriment of the organisation she worked for, as it meant, in her words, that they became funding chasers rather than following the initial principles of the organisations. So she said it all began to change when they started applying for funding, when they started getting wages, because people's priorities changed. A lot of voluntary sector organisations underwent a similar transition in the 1980s and 1990s and faced similar concerns, particularly around mission drift. In the 1970s, these organisations had been on the very front line, on the cutting edge, as Kathleen called it. They were organising to meet a need which was desperately called out for and which had largely been ignored by the state. But as things progressed, they were forced to toe the line, act more professional, more mainstream in order to be taken seriously and receive the money required to survive. Organisations that provided services could no longer be run largely by volunteers, and paid workers were brought in to make them more sustainable. But for many, the drive towards sustainability meant drifting away from the feminist organisational principles by instituting traditional hierarchies. What Susie implies is that there was also a shift in personnel. Many of those that had been involved in these organisations from the start may have burned out and had been replaced by those who weren't directly involved in the women's movement, who hadn't been politicised in the same way, and this perhaps intrinsically changed these organisations. So, to conclude, voluntary organisations like Women's Aid, Refuge and Rape Crisis would not have sprung into being if it wasn't for the women's movement. The WLM provided the motivation, momentum and the workforce of women able and willing to give up their time to address public needs within a feminist framework. It's also important to remember that the work wasn't just done within the organisations that are still around today. a lot of activities were effectively mainstreamed into public services, such as family planning, which is perhaps why their contribution remains invisible and under-recognised. The feminist impetus was obviously very powerful, galvanising many women, but perhaps was not sustainable by itself in the long term. The organisations adapted in order to survive, becoming more professional as they worked more closely with public services. Most of the women I interviewed suggested that this was inevitable and necessary, but they were mostly women who had stayed working in the voluntary sector. It would be revealing to capture the thoughts of those who left these organisations as a result of these changes, disappointed in the direction they were going and the drifting away from feminist principles. I think the example of voluntary work in the WLM and the organisations that emerged out of it throws up some really interesting questions. It highlights the often blurry lines between political activism and voluntary work. It demonstrates how important political motivations can be in influencing people to participate in voluntary action, and it shows the difficult compromises organisations with political aims have to make in order to survive and remain in the future. For some who never wanted to participate in a charity and instead wanted to bring about radical social and political change through their work in these organisations, this may have been a disappointment and perhaps even a betrayal or being seen as selling out. For others, their preparedness to adapt and professionalise were key to the survival of these feminist organisations and helped to mainstream feminist aims and objectives into wider society. They saw and still see the voluntary sector as a site to effect change. So this is by no means an exhaustive study, and there's plenty of research which can be and is being done to explore the complexities of the link between the women's movement and the voluntary sector, and how individuals involved negotiated these relationships as the organisations developed and grew. I've chosen to focus on well-known organisations which emerged from the WM and survived, but there are hundreds of organisations which emerged from this time, including groups and organisations for black and ethnic minority women, which really multiplied in the 1980s. So to try and capture all this, the impact and influence of the women's movement is a big task. But I think it's an important one which would encourage us to rethink the women's movement and its contribution to our society and the voluntary sector we see today. Thank you.